Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We continue with our Early America series by looking at the early republic. This is the full topic, so this one is longer than the individual lessons. Check the description down below for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet that goes along with this video. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. I do my best. Alright, now let's go. Washington's presidency. The Constitution may have created the executive branch, but it left out some crucial details, like how exactly the whole thing was supposed to run. Enter George Washington, the ultimate trendsetter, who had to figure it all out on the fly. To keep things running smoothly, he picked a group of seasoned professionals to help him, kind of like assembling a superhero team, but with more paperwork. This dream team included the Secretaries of State, Treasury, and War, plus the Postmaster General and Attorney General, collectively known as the Cabinet. Of course, Washington didn't have time to bask in his presidential glory because the country was drowning in debt from the American Revolution. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the new Secretary of the Treasury and financial wizard, who had a grand plan to fix things. Step 1. Convince Congress to slap a tariff on imported goods to raise money. Step 2. Buy back all those government bonds floating around. The problem? Many of the original bondholders had long since sold them to speculators for pennies on the dollar. Southerners, led by James Madison, were not thrilled about rewarding these financial gamblers. They were even less thrilled about paying off state debts when they had already handled their own. After some classic political wheeling and dealing, the South agreed to Hamilton's plan in exchange for the nation's capital being built in their backyard. Hello, Washington, D.C. Next on Hamilton's to-do list, a national bank. This institution would hold government funds, issue paper money, and make loans. Essentially, the 18th century version of a modern financial institution, but with more quill pens. But just when things were settling down, along came a new tax on alcohol, which sparked major drama. Farmers in Pennsylvania, who preferred turning their corn into whiskey, because let's be honest, it was way more fun than just selling corn, were furious about the tax and flat out refused to pay. Some even got violent, launching what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington, not one to let things spiral out of control, sent in the militia to shut it down, making it clear that tax evasion via rebellion was not going to fly. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the French Revolution was shaking things up. At first, Americans cheered for the French people rising up against their king, because overthrowing monarchs was kind of their thing. But by 1793, the revolution had turned into a bloodbath, and opinions became sharply divided. Then France decided to attack Austria, prompting Britain to declare war on France. As a French ally, the US found itself in an awkward spot. Washington, ever the cautious leader, decided neutrality was the best option. No need to poke the British bear again so soon. But Britain and France weren't exactly feeling respectful of America's neutrality. Both countries began seizing American ships, causing Washington to send John Jay to negotiate a deal with Britain. The resulting treaty was a bit of a mixed bag. The USC agreed to pay its debts to British merchants, while Britain promised to pay for seized American ships and withdraw troops from the Northwest Territory. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the young nation from getting dragged into war. After 2 terms, Washington had had enough of politics and wrote his farewell address. In it, he basically warned Americans against political infighting. Spoiler alert, they didn't listen, and urged the US to steer clear of European drama. With that, he walked off into history, setting the precedent that 2 terms were enough for any president. A 2-party system develops. Washington had a special talent for keeping Americans on the same page, despite their wildly different opinions. He, like many others, thought political parties were about as good for national unity as a match near a barrel of gunpowder. But of course, people love a good argument, and soon enough, factions started forming, mostly around 2 of Washington's cabinet members, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton believed in a strong central government run by the wealthy and educated. Basically, the "let's leave this to the professionals" approach. Jefferson, on the other hand, put his faith in the everyday American, believing in strong state governments and a more hands-on role for regular folks. The two disagreed on pretty much everything: economic policy, a national bank, foreign affairs. If one said the sky was blue, the other would probably argue it was more of a light gray. By the early 1790s, these differences had solidified into full-blown political parties. Jefferson's crew, the Democratic Republicans, or just Republicans for short, wanted power to stay at the state and local level. Hamilton's team, the Federalists, thought a strong central government was the glue holding the nation together, and thus, the great American tradition of political rivalry was born. Political parties also played a big role in picking Washington's replacement. Back then, the rules for presidential elections were a bit interesting. The person with the most votes became president, and the runner-up got to be vice president. Kind of like winning a race and having your biggest rival forced to be your co-pilot. In 1796, John Adams, a Federalist, won the presidency, while Thomas Jefferson, a Republican, took second place and became vice president. This set the stage for 4 years of political awkwardness, tense debates, and plenty of passive-aggressive letters. Presidents Adams and Jefferson. When the United States decided to stay out of the whole France versus Britain war drama, France was not amused. After all, they had been America's bestie during the Revolution, and now it looked like the U.S. was playing favorites with Britain, especially after signing Jay's Treaty. In response, France gave America the cold shoulder, refused to meet with a U.S. diplomat, and started snatching American ships like a schoolyard bully, taking lunch money. In 1797, President John Adams tried to smooth things over by sending 3 diplomats to France. Instead of a warm welcome, French agents, later codenamed X, Y, and Z because apparently they thought they were in a spy movie, demanded a hefty bribe just for the privilege of talking. The American diplomat said, "Yeah, that's going to be a no from us," and went home. When news of the so-called XYZ affair got out, Americans, especially the Federalists, were outraged. Adams wasn't looking to start a war, but he also couldn't just let France walk all over American ships. So he went on a shopping spree for some fast, gun-loaded frigates and beefed up the Navy. France got the message and backed off. Adams sent another group of diplomats to France, where they met a rising star named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, who was already busy plotting world domination, had no time for an American war and signed a peace treaty in 1800. The Federalists, who were really hoping for a fight, were less than thrilled. Meanwhile, back home, the Federalists decided they didn't trust immigrants, especially those with revolutionary ideas from France. So they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it harder for immigrants to become citizens and giving the president the power to boot out any foreigner he deemed suspicious. As a bonus, they also made it illegal to insult the government, a rule that conveniently targeted the Republican opposition. Naturally, this did not go over well with Republicans like Thomas Jefferson, who were all about free speech. They tried to overturn the laws through state legislatures, leading to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which introduced the whole idea that states could ignore federal laws they didn't like. Spoiler alert, this idea would come back in a big way later in American history. By 1802, the Alien and Sedition Acts had expired, the citizenship waiting period was back to 5 years, and America continued its love-hate relationship with free speech. Then came the 1800 presidential election, a political brawl for the ages. Jefferson, the Democratic-Republican candidate, won with 73 electoral votes. But wait, so did his running mate, Aaron Burr. Thanks to the oh-so-functional election system of the time, it was now up to the House of Representatives to break the tie. After days of intense debate, and likely some very awkward glances between Jefferson and Burr, the House finally picked Jefferson. To prevent future electoral headaches, the 12th Amendment was later added to ensure separate votes for president and vice president. This election was the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party. Jefferson saw his presidency as a fresh start, calling it the Revolution of 1800. His mission? Shrink the federal government and embrace laissez-faire, a fancy French way of saying, let's just not interfere with the economy and see what happens. Before leaving office, Adams and the Federalists tried one last power move. They passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, adding a bunch of new federal judges, most of them conveniently Federalists. Jefferson and his team weren't having it, firing 16 of them as soon as he took office. But one powerful Federalist, Chief Justice John Marshall, stuck around. Then came Marbury v. Madison, the case that would change everything. William Marbury had been promised a judgeship, but Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver the paperwork. Marbury sued, and the case made its way to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Marshall saw an opportunity to flex the court's power. Instead of ruling in Marbury's favor, he declared that the law giving the court the power to do so was actually unconstitutional. Boom. Judicial review was born. From then on, the Supreme Court had the final say on whether laws were constitutional, which made it way more powerful than before. Jefferson and the Republicans weren't thrilled, but in the end, they accepted the ruling. And just like that, the three branches of government settled into their power dynamics, at least until the next big political showdown. A changing nation. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson got some juicy gossip. Spain had quietly handed over New Orleans and the entire Louisiana territory to France. This was bad news because Napoleon Bonaparte, France's power-hungry, Europe-conquering superstar, was not the kind of neighbor Jefferson wanted. New Orleans was the lifeline for Americans west of the Appalachians, so Jefferson decided to make France an offer they couldn't refuse, hopefully without any mobster-style negotiations. He sent Robert Livingston and James Monroe to Paris to try and buy New Orleans and West Florida. But surprise! Napoleon, strapped for cash to fund his endless wars, countered with an even better deal. Why not take all of Louisiana for just $15 million? Jefferson, who had a strict interpretation of the Constitution, had a brief, "Wait, can I even do this?" moment before deciding, we'll figure it out later. And just like that, the U.S. doubled in size with the biggest real estate bargain in history. Of course, no one really knew what was in this massive new land, so Jefferson sent out some explorers to find out. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark packed their bags and set off to map a route to the Pacific, making friends and enemies along the way. Meanwhile, Zebulon Pike took a detour to the southwest, where the Spanish weren't too thrilled about his snooping. They arrested him, confiscated his maps, and sent him back home. But Pike had a trick up his sleeve, literally. He hid one map in his gun barrel, so Americans still got some intel on the Southwest. While America was busy expanding, its trade was booming, with New England ship captains sailing as far as India and China. But not everyone was thrilled about this, especially the Barbary pirates of North Africa, who preferred to take goods rather than trade for them. Like other nations, the U.S. had been paying tribute to keep their ships safe, but when Tripoli's ruler demanded more money, Jefferson decided, enough is enough. Instead of paying up, he sent the Navy, and after some fighting, Tripoli signed a truce. Meanwhile, Britain and France went back to their favorite pastime, fighting each other. Naturally, they started seizing American ships that traded with their enemy, because why not drag the U.S. into their mess? Britain took things a step further by kidnapping, impressing American sailors and forcing them into their navy. Jefferson, fed up with both sides, tried a bold move, an embargo. In 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act, which basically grounded all American trade. No imports, no exports, just a whole lot of economic misery. Instead of punishing Britain and France, it mostly hurt American businesses, with exports dropping by over $80 million. Smuggling became the new national pastime, and Jefferson's popularity took a hit. By 1809, Congress replaced the embargo with a less painful version that only banned trade with Britain and France. Despite the backlash, the Democratic Republicans still managed to win the 1808 election, putting James Madison in the White House. Now it was his turn to deal with the growing international chaos. Stay tuned for Madison and the War of 1812. Despite the U.S. government signing hundreds of treaties with Native American nations, and let's be honest, breaking a lot of them, white settlers moving westward still managed to stir up trouble. Two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, aka the Prophet, had seen enough. They called for a return to traditional ways and resistance against American expansion. Tecumseh hit the road, traveling far and wide to unite native nations into a confederation, while his brother stayed back, probably wishing LinkedIn had been invented so this whole networking thing would be easier. The US government was not thrilled about Tecumseh's growing influence. While he was away, Indiana Territory Governor William Henry Harrison saw his chance and launched an attack on Prophetstown, a Shawnee settlement on the Tippecanoe River. The battle was a brutal mess, leaving heavy losses on both sides, but it made Harrison a war hero. Spoiler, he'd later parlay this into a presidential campaign, but that's another story. Meanwhile, the British had been playing the Let's Annoy America game by supplying Native Americans with weapons and encouraging attacks on settlers. They were also busy ignoring American neutrality by seizing US ships and impressing American sailors, which is just a fancy way of saying kidnapping them and forcing them into the British Navy. This really got under the skin of a group of patriotic, battle-hungry congressmen known as the Warhawks, who started chanting, "Let's go to war," like it was their team's motto. Not everyone was on board, though. New Englanders who depended on trade worried war would wreck the economy. But war it was. There was just one small problem. Thanks to military budget cuts under Jefferson, the US was about as ready for a war as a toddler is for a marathon. The Navy had a whopping 17 warships, while Britain had, hundreds. To fill the ranks, the government lured volunteers in with promises of money and land, which, for the record, it wasn't entirely sure it had. Britain quickly blockaded American ports, and the US struggled to break through. One bright spot, the USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, managed to defeat the British warship Guerriere, which was a morale booster but didn't exactly change the course of the war. The Warhawks, still convinced they could annex Canada, sent troops northward. The result? Mostly failure. But in a rare success, US forces captured and burned York, now Toronto, looting British supplies and weapons along the way. On Lake Erie, Captain Oliver Hazard Perry turned things around by defeating the British Navy, which forced them and their native allies, led by Tecumseh, to retreat into Canada. The Americans pursued, and in the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh was killed, ending his dream of a united native confederation. Then, in 1814, Britain defeated Napoleon for the time being, and finally turned its full attention to the US. The result? A British invasion of Washington, D.C., where they burned the White House. Yes, the actual White House. They then moved on to Baltimore and bombarded Fort McHenry all night long. But when the sun came up, the American flag was still flying. This moment inspired a guy named Francis Scott Key to write a little something called the Star-Spangled Banner. While some New Englanders started grumbling about secession because this war was bad for business, the British planned one final strike, New Orleans. But waiting for them was none other than General Andrew Jackson, who led a ragtag force, including pirates, frontier militiamen, and free black soldiers, to a shocking victory over the British. The irony? The war had actually ended 2 weeks earlier when the Treaty of Ghent was signed. News just traveled really slowly back then. In the end, opinions on the War of 1812 were split. Some called it a mistake, while others saw it as a defining moment for the young nation. Regardless, America walked away feeling a little tougher, a little prouder, and, whether they liked it or not, a lot more American. Monroe's presidency and everyday life. After the War of 1812, the Republicans were basically the only party left standing. James Monroe won the 1816 election so overwhelmingly that the Federalist Party got crushed like a bug on a windshield. To celebrate his victory lap, Monroe went on a goodwill tour of the country where even the states that didn't vote for him still welcomed him with open arms. A Boston newspaper called this new wave of unity the era of good feelings, which is ironic considering that politics would soon get messy again. But hey, it was nice while it lasted. During this time, 3 political heavyweights rose to prominence. Henry Clay of Kentucky, the voice of the West, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the champion of the South, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, representing the Northeast. These guys would spend the next few decades arguing over everything. Meanwhile, the economy was all over the place. The charter for the First National Bank had expired in 1811, and state banks went a little wild, printing money, handing out loans, and generally making a mess of things. The result? Inflation. So the government hit reset and created the second Bank of the United States to bring some stability. Then came the tariff drama. During the War of 1812, Americans had started their own factories since British imports weren't available. But once the war ended, British manufacturers flooded the U.S. with cheap goods, putting American businesses on life support. Congress responded with the Tariff of 1816, which put taxes on foreign goods like cloth and iron. This was great for northern manufacturers, but a major headache for the South, where folks didn't have many factories and just wanted cheap imports. Enter Henry Clay, who had a grand idea called the American System. His plan? Use tariff money to fund roads, bridges, and canals to connect the country and boost trade. It was a lovely idea in theory, but Southerners weren't buying it, literally or figuratively. They saw the tariffs as a northern scheme to make them pay more for goods, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court was flexing its muscles. In McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, the court ruled that states couldn't mess with federal institutions. So no, Maryland, you can't tax the national bank just because you feel like it. In Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, the court smacked down a New York law that gave one company a monopoly on steamboat travel, stating that only Congress could regulate interstate trade. And in Dartmouth College v. Woodward, 1819, the court protected private contracts, making it harder for states to interfere in business deals. All in all, these cases strengthened federal power and set some big legal precedents. Meanwhile, Spain was having a really bad time. Inspired by the American and French revolutions, Latin American colonies started breaking free. Mexico made its first attempt at rebellion in 1810 under Father Miguel Hidalgo, which unfortunately didn't work out. But by 1821, Spain was exhausted, and Mexico officially won independence, becoming a republic in 1823. The rest of Latin America followed suit, kicking Spain to the curb by 1825. However, these new nations quickly found that ruling themselves was a lot harder than expected, and power struggles soon erupted. Spain also realized it was hanging on to Florida by a thread, especially since American settlers were basically treating it like an extension of Georgia. Rather than fighting a losing battle, Spain cut a deal. For $5 million, they handed over Florida in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. And just like that, Florida was part of the U.S., swamps, mosquitoes, and all. But Monroe wasn't done making bold moves. In 1823, he issued what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, basically telling Europe, hey, no more colonizing the Americas, or we'll take it very personally. In reality, the U.S. wasn't powerful enough to enforce this. Only Britain's Navy could actually back it up. But Monroe still set the tone for U.S. foreign policy for the next century. At home, most Americans were still living the rural life. Churches were the social hubs, and thanks to new state constitutions separating church and state, Catholics and Jews could practice their religions more freely. Free African Americans were establishing their own schools, and public libraries made books more accessible. Meanwhile, uniquely American forms of art, music, and literature were starting to emerge, proving that the young nation was finally developing its own cultural identity, one that didn't rely on copying Europe for everything. So while the era of good feelings might not have lasted forever, it was a time of expansion, economic experiments, and some serious growing pains. But hey, at least Florida was finally on the map. Okay, let's recap. George Washington's presidency set key precedents, from forming the cabinet to handling financial crises with Alexander Hamilton's economic plans. His leadership was tested by the Whiskey Rebellion, where he demonstrated federal authority and foreign challenges, like maintaining neutrality amid the French and British conflicts. Despite his warning against political divisions, Hamilton and Jefferson's rivalry birthed the first two-party system. John Adams' presidency saw tensions with France explode into the XYZ affair, the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, and the election of 1800, which led to Jefferson's presidency and the rise of judicial review through Marbury v. Madison. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase doubled U.S. territory, while Madison's presidency was defined by conflicts with Britain, culminating in the War of 1812. Monroe's era saw temporary political unity, economic shifts, and Supreme Court decisions that strengthened federal power, all while Latin American nations began asserting independence. There you have it, folks. That is the early republic nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Go nuts on those like and subscribe buttons for me so that I can keep my good feelings. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.